The whiskey sat untouched as Wimsey's mind turned back to the precise moment when everything had begun to unravel. Not at Ashford Manor, but here, in London, 3 days prior, when he had received Eleanor's letter. He found himself reconsidering the phrasing of her request, the particular desperation that had emanated from those careful, trembling sentences. A woman doesn't appeal to a private detective about footsteps in corridors unless something deeper troubles her, something that transcends the mere curiosity of timing. The telephone on his desk rang at 10:30, which was precisely the sort of hour that guaranteed bad news. Wimsey lifted the receiver with the casual indifference of a man accustomed to being interrupted at inconvenient moments. "Lord Wimsey?" The voice was male, cultured and strained. "This is Inspector Pettigrew. I apologize for the hour, but we have a development that requires your immediate attention." Wimsey set down his whiskey with the care of a man placing something fragile. "I rather suspected you might ring. What has occurred, Inspector? Has Thomas Herrick attempted to flee?" "No, sir. Quite the opposite. Herrick came to the station of his own volition approximately 2 hours ago. He came with documents, letters, ledgers, and financial records. He has deposited them all with my sergeant and then walked into the interview room and closed the door. We found him there not 20 minutes ago, hanging from the light fixture by a leather belt." The silence that followed was absolute. Wimsey's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes, some calculation, some terrible reassessment, shifted with glacial precision. "And Eleanor?" he asked quietly. "That is the concerning part, sir. Mrs. Ashford has disappeared. The servants report that she left the house approximately an hour after you departed. She took a motor car, hired one from the village, and has not been seen since. We have inquiries out, but as of yet, nothing has surfaced." Wimsey rose abruptly, his tall frame suddenly seeming inadequate to contain whatever he was thinking. "The documents Herrick left, what did they contain?" "Financial records going back some 15 years. Bank statements, wire transfers, receipts. All of them indicate payments from Sir Geoffrey to Thomas Herrick in amounts far exceeding what a gamekeeper would ordinarily receive. The sums are considerable, sir, tens of thousands of pounds." "Did they indeed?" Wimsey murmured. He moved to his desk and withdrew a leather map case, opening it to reveal a detailed ordnance survey of Derbyshire. "Tell me, Inspector, when you examined the gun room earlier, when I directed your attention there, did you perhaps notice any peculiarities about the weapons themselves? Any that seemed recently acquired or deliberately concealed?" "We found nothing unusual, sir. The weapons appeared to be of the sort one would expect in such a collection." "Then you did not look carefully." "Enough," Wimsey said, and his tone suggested that this was neither accusation nor excuse, but merely observation of fact. "The pistol I found in the gun-room cupboard, the one I claimed was Sir Geoffrey's murder weapon. Did you verify its provenance?" "We assumed it was part of Sir Geoffrey's collection, sir. The serial number indicated continental manufacture. French, from approximately 1885. "Precisely 1885, Wimsey said, more to himself than to Pettigrew. "The year Catherine Volkova departed Russia. The year she supposedly died in a carriage accident. Inspector, I believe I've made a rather catastrophic error in my reasoning, and that error has just taken the life of a loyal servant who understood far more than I gave him credit for understanding." He replaced the telephone's receiver momentarily, then lifted it again and spoke to his operator with the precision of a man issuing military commands. "Ring through to Derby Police Station. Tell Inspector Pettigrew that he is to send immediately to the railway station, to the dock, and to all roads leading north. He is to apprehend a woman, approximately 55 years of age, possibly travelling under the name Eleanor Ashford or variations thereof. She is to be considered dangerous and possibly armed. Ring back when you have confirmed the message has been delivered." He replaced the receiver and turned to Bunter, who had appeared in the doorway with the uncanny timing that characterized his entire existence. "The motor car, Bunter." I require the Daimler brought round immediately." "Begging your pardon, sir, but it has only been returned to the garage within the past hour. The journey to Derbyshire, undertaken at proper speeds, would require considerable time." "Then we shall travel at improper speeds," Wimsey said. He was already retrieving his overcoat, his movements sharp and economical. "And whilst we drive, you shall listen to a hypothesis so troublingly logical that I am astonished I did not perceive it earlier." As Bunter handed him his hat, Wimsey continued, his words tumbling forth with the rapid precision of a man correcting himself mid-calculation. "I told Eleanor that the dead are not appeased by apologies, but I failed to ask the crucial question, who, precisely, is dead? I assumed Sir Geoffrey's death was suicide, driven by despair at Eleanor's revelation. But what if Eleanor was not the woman I believed her to be? What if she was not Catherine Volkova returned, but something considerably more calculated? What if Thomas Herrick's payments were not blackmail for silence, but compensation for something far more deliberate? He paused at the threshold, his hand on the door frame. What if Eleanor orchestrated the entire revelation of Catherine's identity for a specific purpose? What if she needed Sir Geoffrey to discover he had been deceived, needed him to be driven to despair and suicide, because suicide would place his considerable estate in a very specific legal position? And what if Thomas Herrick, having finally understood what Eleanor had done, what she had driven him to assist in, could no longer endure the weight of that knowledge? The motor car was waiting, its engine already warming. Wimsey climbed into the driver's seat without waiting for Bunter to settle himself, and the machine lurched forward into the London night with the desperate speed of a man racing toward a truth that was simultaneously growing clearer and infinitely more terrible with each passing moment. The road to Derbyshire unwound beneath them in a ribbon of grey concrete, and Wimsey drove with the concentration of a man for whom speed had become not merely a means of transport, but a form of meditation. Bunter sat rigid in the passenger seat, his hands folded with characteristic precision, though his eyes betrayed the keen intelligence that observed every turn, every acceleration, every moment when his employer's thoughts were audible in the very pressure of his foot upon the accelerator. "The estate," Wimsey said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for the better part of 40 minutes, "would pass to Eleanor upon Sir Geoffrey's death, would it not? As his widow, she would inherit the entirety of his considerable holdings, the manor itself, the lands, and the liquid assets. Barring a will that specifically disinherited her, which seems unlikely given the recent nature of their marriage. No more than, 5 years? She would be in absolute possession of everything." Bunter's response was measured. "The question of Sir Geoffrey's will would be a matter of public record, sir, once it enters probate. If Mrs. Ashford had orchestrated his death with the intention of inheriting, she would be aware that such a motive would become evident to anyone with access to legal documents." "Precisely so," Wimsey agreed, swerving to avoid a lorry that had wandered into his path with the casual indifference of vehicles driven by men past caring about their mortality. "Which suggests that either Eleanor is astonishingly confident in her ability to evade suspicion, or the inheritance is not her primary motive at all. Unless, of course, the will contains some provision that would require Sir Geoffrey's death to activate. Something contingent, something tied to Eleanor's marital status or her discovery of Catherine's identity." He pressed the accelerator further, and the speedometer climbed toward figures that would have horrified the average motorist. "Consider the timeline with fresh perspective, Bunter. Eleanor receives word from Sophia, from Catherine's genuine daughter, that the secret is about to be exposed. Rather than fleeing, rather than attempting to prevent the revelation, what does Eleanor do? She invites me to Derbyshire. She brings a detective into the house specifically to investigate the very matter that should most terrify her. Why would she do such a thing unless she required a witness? Unless she required someone of sufficient standing and reputation to validate whatever story she intended to construct? The moon had risen, casting the landscape in shades of silver and shadow. Wimsey's headlamps cut through the darkness with mechanical precision, illuminating the road ahead in a narrow corridor of visibility that seemed to mirror the narrowing of possibilities as his theory solidified. Sir Geoffrey's first wife, Wimsey continued, his voice taking on the quality of someone speaking to himself, dies in 1885. Or does she? What if Catherine Volkova did not die in a carriage accident at all? What if she orchestrated her own disappearance, a woman fleeing a marriage she could not maintain, a woman who had perhaps come to realize she could not be the wife Sir Geoffrey required? And what if she remained in England, lived in hiding, and somehow, through some connection neither we nor Sir Geoffrey fully understood, came into contact with Eleanor? Bunter shifted slightly, his expression remaining neutral but his voice carrying an undertone of concern. You are suggesting that Eleanor Ashford is not a separate woman at all, sir, but rather an alternative identity assumed by Catherine Volkova herself? Not merely assumed, Wimsey said, taking a sharp curve with more speed than prudence recommended. Inhabited, lived in, perfected. Consider, a woman disappears in 1885. A woman appears in Sir Geoffrey's life. When? 5 years ago. And is there any independent verification of her origins, her family, her history prior to their marriage? Or is all of that based entirely upon what Eleanor herself has told him and what he has chosen to believe? The logic of it was both elegant and terrible. Wimsey's hands tightened on the wheel as the implications cascaded through his mind like dominoes falling in a pattern that had been set in motion 31 years prior. But if Eleanor is Catherine, Bunter ventured carefully, then what purpose is served by engineering Sir Geoffrey's discovery of her identity and subsequent suicide? A woman who has successfully hidden her past for 3 decades would not deliberately expose herself. Unless, Wimsey said slowly, the exposure was never meant to succeed. Unless I was intended to arrive at exactly the conclusions I reached, that Eleanor was Catherine returned, that Sir Geoffrey killed himself from despair, that Thomas Herrick was merely a loyal servant keeping silent about his employer's method of death. And in reaching those conclusions, I was to validate a specific version of events that would satisfy the law, satisfy the police, and allow Eleanor to inherit everything whilst appearing entirely innocent of any wrongdoing. He accelerated further, the speedometer now registering figures that made Bunter's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. But I made an error, didn't I? I didn't account for guilt. I didn't account for the possibility that a man like Thomas Herrick, a man who kept secrets for 3 decades, who accepted payment for his complicity, who allowed an innocent woman to be accused of murder she did not commit, might finally break beneath the weight of what he had done, might finally decide that some silences are too heavy to maintain. The lights of Derby appeared ahead, glowing against the dark sky like a beacon toward truth rather than salvation. Wimsey's expression had hardened into something approaching granite. Eleanor has fled, he said, because she understands that Thomas has finally spoken. And if Thomas has spoken, then the documents he left behind will tell us precisely what Eleanor was using him to accomplish, will tell us what secret he was paid such extraordinary sums to keep, and what role, if any, he played in orchestrating the deception that has cost us all so dearly. The motor car surged forward into the night, carrying them toward revelation and toward the terrible understanding that sometimes the most convincing detective is the one who has allowed himself to be thoroughly deceived. The Derby police station smelled of stale cigarettes and the particular despair that accumulates in institutional corridors at 3 in the morning. Inspector Pettigrew was waiting in the entrance hall, his brick wall face now crumbling slightly at the edges. The expression of a man who had built his career upon the assumption that things would remain comprehensible, and was being forced to confront the possibility that comprehension was a luxury afforded only to those who asked the right questions early enough. "The documents," Wimsey said, dispensing with pleasantries as he crossed the threshold. "Show me everything." Pettigrew led him through a warren of administrative corridors to a small room where a constable sat guard over a leather satchel. The contents, when spread across the examination table, told a story far more complex and considerably more damning than the simple narrative of suicide that Wimsey had constructed in the study at Ashford Manor. The financial records began in 1895, a year after Sir Geoffrey's marriage to Catherine. The entries were coded, the amounts substantial, and the pattern unmistakable. Monthly payments to T.H. increasing in proportion to Sir Geoffrey's own increasing wealth. But what made the documents significant were the notations in Sir Geoffrey's own handwriting, dated years later, that accompanied the most recent transfers. Compensation for discretion regarding C.V.'s continued survival. One entry read, dated 1920. Payment for silence concerning identity transfer and assumed estate of E.A. contingent upon continued maintenance of necessary fiction. Wimsey set down the document with the care of a man handling evidence of his own professional failure. He knew, Sir Geoffrey knew all along, that Catherine had not died in that carriage accident. He knew she had survived, knew she had disappeared, knew that Eleanor was in some fashion connected to Catherine's disappearance. Pettigrew's expression shifted, from confusion towards something more like horror. Then the suicide was not driven by the revelation of deception, Wimsey finished, but by something considerably more calculated. He was not a man driven to despair, Inspector. He was a man paying an extraordinarily high price for a secret, and that price was finally becoming excessive. He moved to another set of documents. Letters, most of them, written in a hand that Wimsey recognized from the correspondence hidden in Sir Geoffrey's study. But these letters were recent, dated within the past 3 months, and they were written in a trembling script that suggested either age or extreme emotion. "My dearest Geoffrey," one read, "your latest payment has been received and has resolved certain pressing difficulties. I continue to marvel at your discretion and your generosity, though I confess I remain troubled by the burden this arrangement has placed upon you. The time may be approaching when circumstances demand a permanent resolution to our situation. I hope you will forgive me for what necessity may require. C." Wimsey looked up from the letter, and when he spoke, his voice carried an undertone of something approaching pity. She was dying. Catherine was dying, and she was writing to her husband, for that is what he remained in every meaningful sense, regardless of the legal fiction that Eleanor represented, to tell him that the time for this elaborate deception was drawing to a close. But how could Catherine be? Pettigrew began, then stopped, the logic of it crashing down upon him. The woman who came to see Sir Geoffrey 3 weeks ago, the mysterious visitor with the envelope. That wasn't Sophia at all, was it? That was Catherine, Wimsey said quietly. The authentic Catherine Volkova, Sir Geoffrey's first wife, who had not died in 1885 but had merely vanished into a different life, perhaps under yet another assumed name. She came to see her husband because she was aware that her time was limited and because Sophia, their daughter, had begun investigating her mother's disappearance. Catherine came to warn Sir Geoffrey that the secret was becoming unsustainable, that measures would need to be taken. He turned back to the financial records, examining the entries with fresh understanding. How much has he paid her over the course of all these years? Pettigrew made quick calculations. Approximately £300,000, sir, a staggering sum, enough to establish a woman in considerable comfort, to provide for any number of dependents. Enough, Wimsey said, to maintain an alternative identity in perpetuity. Enough to keep a woman alive and hidden whilst her husband lived with Eleanor, who I now suspect was not an alternative identity of Catherine at all, but rather a woman deliberately placed in Sir Geoffrey's life as a means of maintaining Catherine's disappearance. He sank into a chair, the weight of understanding finally settling upon him. Eleanor was never Catherine. Eleanor was Catherine's accomplice, perhaps her daughter by some earlier liaison, perhaps simply a woman Catherine had recruited to serve as her proxy, to maintain the fiction that Sir Geoffrey's first wife was dead, whilst keeping him financially invested in her actual survival. And Thomas Herrick was the intermediary, the man who conveyed payments, who kept watch, who ensured that the deception remained intact. "Then who killed Sir Geoffrey?" Pettigrew asked, and there was genuine confusion in his voice. "Geoffrey killed himself," Wimsey said, "but not because he had suddenly discovered Eleanor's deception. He killed himself because Catherine, his authentic wife, his genuine love, who had vanished 31 years prior, sent word through Sophia that she was dying and that she intended to confess everything. She intended to come forward to reveal that Sir Geoffrey had been complicit in her own disappearance, that he had paid her to remain hidden, that Eleanor's entire existence was a carefully constructed lie designed to maintain the separation between Sir Geoffrey's public life and his private obligation to the woman he could never quite cease to love." Wimsey stood and moved toward the window, where the grey light of early dawn was beginning to creep across the horizon. He chose to die rather than endure the exposure that Catherine's confession would bring. He shot himself, stopped his pocket watch at the false time, and left a letter instructing Thomas to dispose of the evidence. But Thomas, poor, loyal, guilt-ridden Thomas, finally understood that he had spent 31 years serving a lie, and that lie had just cost a man his life. So he came to the police with documentation, and then he hanged himself, because some knowledge, once acquired, becomes too heavy to bear. "And Eleanor?" Pettigrew asked. "Eleanor," Wimsey said grimly, "has fled because she understands that without Sir Geoffrey and without Thomas, the entire structure of her existence has collapsed. She was created to serve a specific purpose, to maintain a dead woman's presumption of death. Now that both architect and assistant have removed themselves, she has nothing left but flight." The constable assigned to monitor the railway stations reported at dawn that a woman matching Eleanor's description had purchased a ticket to Southampton at approximately 2:47 in the morning. She had travelled alone, carried a single valise, and had paid in cash with notes of high denomination. By the time the constable's report reached Wimsey, Eleanor was already 3 hours into her journey toward the coast, toward whatever vessel might be willing to transport her away from England and into the anonymity that distance alone could provide. Wimsey stood in the police station's administrative office, holding the telegram with the detachment of a man observing evidence of his own profound miscalculation. The morning light, now fully established, rendered every detail of the room with merciless clarity. The worn furniture, the coffee stains on the desk blotter, the portrait of King George hanging slightly askew on the wall. Everything appeared exactly as it should be, and yet nothing was quite what it appeared to be. The realization settled upon him with the weight of an unwelcome truth that cannot be disputed. "Southampton," Pettigrew said, standing beside him with the posture of a man awaiting orders. "We can telegraph ahead, have her apprehended at the docks before she boards any outbound vessel. It will take perhaps 4 hours for her to reach the coast, and if she intends to depart by sea, she must find passage. That cannot be accomplished instantaneously." "No," Wimsey agreed, though something in his expression suggested that agreement did not constitute enthusiasm. "But consider the remarkable question this presents, Inspector. Why would a woman guilty of conspiracy in her husband's death? For that is what Eleanor has become in our revised understanding, regardless of who actually pulled the trigger. Flee in such a deliberate and traceable manner. She has left a clear path, identifiable witnesses, documented proof of her destination. Either Eleanor is remarkably foolish, or she is remarkably confident that apprehension will not serve justice in any meaningful way." Pettigrew's brick wall expression fractured slightly. "You believe she intends to escape before we can establish her legal culpability?" "I believe," Wimsey said carefully, "that Eleanor has made a calculation regarding the relative merits of flight versus prosecution. She understands, as do I, that the evidence we possess is extraordinarily tangled. Sir Geoffrey died by his own hand, a suicide that was documented and witnessed by the household staff. The conspiracy that led to his despair, the elaborate deception involving Catherine's survival, Thomas Herrick's complicity, Eleanor's assumed identity, is established through financial records and correspondence, but proving Eleanor's knowledge of these arrangements presents considerable legal difficulty. A clever solicitor would argue that she was merely a woman married to an eccentric man who conducted bizarre financial arrangements unknown to her. She might well escape prosecution entirely. He turned from the window, his expression hardening, which means that Eleanor's flight is not an admission of guilt, but rather a calculated escape from a situation that no longer serves her purposes. She has inherited nothing, Sir Geoffrey's death, while providing her with an opportunity to claim his estate, has simultaneously exposed her to investigation. The inheritance will be frozen pending resolution of the criminal matter. She will have access to neither the manor nor the liquid assets. In short, Eleanor has lost everything that made her position at Ashford Manor worth maintaining. A constable entered with a fresh pot of tea, which Pettigrew accepted with distracted gratitude. Wimsey ignored the beverage entirely, his mind clearly occupied with calculations that had nothing to do with refreshment. The question becomes, Wimsey continued, whether Eleanor's flight is entirely self-interested or whether it serves some larger purpose. We know Catherine was dying. We know Eleanor was Catherine's accomplice or surrogate or proxy. The precise nature of their relationship remains unclear, but their cooperation is evident. If Catherine was Eleanor's employer in some meaningful sense, then Eleanor's flight might be motivated by something other than mere self-preservation. "You believe Eleanor is protecting Catherine?" Pettigrew asked, and his tone suggested that this possibility had not occurred to him until this precise moment. "I believe Eleanor is attempting to reach Catherine before we do," Wimsey corrected. "Catherine is alive, Inspector. She was alive 3 weeks ago when she visited her husband. She may very well be alive still, possibly in hiding somewhere in England, possibly already preparing to depart for the continent. If Eleanor reaches her first, if Eleanor reaches her before the authorities do, then Catherine will have the opportunity to disappear permanently, to ensure that her existence remains the carefully guarded secret it has been for 3 decades. He moved toward the door with the decisive movement of a man whose next action had crystallized into absolute clarity. "I require access to the financial records, specifically the most recent transactions. If Catherine is alive and Eleanor is attempting to reach her, Eleanor will require resources. She will need to provide Catherine with funds, with documents, with the apparatus of disappearance, and that apparatus must be funded through some mechanism we can trace." Pettigrew gestured to the constable, who immediately produced a leather folder containing the most recent financial extracts from Sir Geoffrey's accounts. Wimsey examined them with the intensity of a man reading scripture, his eyes moving across the columns of figures with practiced precision. "Here," he said, pointing to an entry dated 3 days prior to Eleanor's arrival at Ashford Manor. "A withdrawal of £5,000 in cash, withdrawn from Sir Geoffrey's private account and paid to an accommodation address in Whitechapel, and again dated the day after Sir Geoffrey's funeral. Another £3,000 transferred to a boarding house in Bloomsbury under the name of Morrison." "Payments to Catherine," Pettigrew breathed, understanding beginning to dawn. "Precisely so," Wimsey said. "Catherine has been living in London whilst maintaining the fiction of her own death. Whilst Eleanor lived as the mistress of Ashford Manor, Catherine was ensconced in modest lodgings in the city, drawing regular income from her complicit husband, waiting for death to finally resolve the extraordinary deception she had constructed." He turned to face Pettigrew directly. "We must locate this accommodation address in Bloomsbury immediately. We must reach Catherine before Eleanor does. And we must be prepared for the possibility that when we find her, we will discover not merely a woman who is hidden for 31 years, but a woman prepared to take whatever final steps are necessary to ensure that her secret dies with her." The boarding house at 47 Gower Street presented itself to the morning light with the dingy respectability of establishments that asked no questions and maintained no records. The proprietress, a woman of indeterminate age with the weary expression of someone who had seen every possible human transgression and had long ago ceased to regard any of them as remarkable, admitted them with the casual efficiency of someone accustomed to police visits. "Mrs. Morrison?" Pettigrew inquired, displaying the warrant that granted them access to the premises. "Top floor, back room," the woman said, gesturing toward a staircase that climbed into shadow. "She's been with us near on 3 years. Quiet tenant, pays her rent regular, never entertains visitors. I'd have said she was respectable if not for the fact that no one knows anything about her." Wimsey ascended the stairs with Pettigrew at his heels, and 2 constables following behind with the grim purposefulness of men prepared for contingencies that might or might not manifest. The corridor smelled of boiled cabbage and despair, that particular amalgamation of scents that accumulates in boarding houses where people exist rather than live. The door at the end of the top-floor passage was painted a nondescript brown, and it bore no nameplate, no indication of occupancy beyond the simple fact that it existed. Pettigrew knocked with the formal authority of a man empowered by law to demand entry. There was no response. He knocked again, louder, with increasingly insistent emphasis. Still nothing, only silence, absolute and complete, the kind of silence that suggests either empty rooms or the terrible stillness of someone who is determined that nothing that happens beyond a particular threshold holds sufficient interest to warrant acknowledgement. "Break it down," Wimsey said quietly. The constable assigned to such tasks required only moderate persuasion before the lock surrendered to the force of his shoulder. The door swung open to reveal a room that was simultaneously sparse and meticulously arranged. A narrow bed, a writing desk, a single chair positioned toward the window. And in that chair, positioned with the careful deliberation of someone who had thought considerably about how she wished to be discovered, sat a woman who might have been 60 or might have been 90, her thin frame draped in black silk, her hands folded in her lap with the stillness of statue. She was quite dead. The instrument of her demise was not immediately apparent until Wimsey moved closer and observed the small glass beside her, empty now, but bearing the faint smell of bitter almonds. Prussic acid, administered, in what was clearly a voluntary and deliberate manner. She had been dead, he estimated, for somewhere between 4 and 8 hours, which placed her death at approximately the time Eleanor had begun her journey toward Southampton. "She knew," Pettigrew said, his voice carrying the flat quality of someone stating an obvious fact that nevertheless required utterance. When Eleanor left Ashford Manor, Catherine knew what that departure signified. She knew that the secret was unraveling. "More than that," Wimsey said, examining the room with meticulous attention. She knew what Eleanor's departure meant before Eleanor herself perhaps fully understood it. Catherine had calculated the precise moment when her daughter, for I now suspect that Eleanor is indeed Catherine's biological daughter, not merely her accomplice, would attempt to reach her, and she calculated that the cost of Eleanor's escape and her own concealment would exceed whatever remaining life Catherine possessed. So she made a choice. On the writing desk there was a single letter, addressed in careful script to Lord Peter Wimsey. Wimsey opened it with the deliberation of a man unwrapping something both precious and terrible, and he read aloud, "My lord, if you are reading this, then Sir Geoffrey has told you the truth, or at least as much of the truth as he understood. I do not expect your forgiveness, as I have long since ceased to expect forgiveness from anyone, including myself, but I offer you explanation for what explanation is worth. I married Sir Geoffrey in 1882, believing myself capable of becoming what he required. I was wrong. I discovered after 2 years of marriage that I could not be the woman he wished me to be. Rather than destroy him with the revelation of my nature, for I was not, and am not, what respectable society would recognize as a proper wife, I chose to disappear. I engineered the carriage accident, I staged my death, and I allowed Sir Geoffrey to mourn me whilst I built a different life. My daughter Eleanor was born before my marriage to Sir Geoffrey, to a man I have not named and will not name. She is innocent of the conspiracy I orchestrated. She agreed to assume my identity only because I convinced her it was necessary, that her father, your father, Eleanor, if you read this, deserved to believe me dead rather than to know the truth of what I am. I have lived 31 years in hiding, sustained by my husband's remarkable and tragic devotion. I have watched my daughter grow to womanhood. I have observed the slow destruction my deception wrought upon a good man. I will not permit that destruction to continue beyond this moment. Eleanor, if you reach this letter, you must know that you are not responsible for my choices, nor for the consequences those choices have generated. Flee if you wish. Live freely under whatever identity you choose. You owe nothing to the fiction I created. And to you, Lord Peter, I say only this. Some secrets die with the people who keep them. This is not a matter of law or justice. This is a matter of mercy. It was signed simply, Catherine. Wimsey set down the letter with trembling hands. Pettigrew stood beside him, his expression unreadable, processing the implications of what they had discovered. Eleanor had not been fleeing toward escape alone. She had been racing toward her mother, attempting to reach Catherine before the police did, hoping perhaps to spirit her away, to give her some final moments of unobserved freedom before the machinery of law descended. Instead, Eleanor would arrive to find nothing but a corpse and a letter, and the absolute, irreversible knowledge that her mother had chosen death over the complications that Eleanor's flight would have created. "We must inform Mrs. Eleanor Ashford," Pettigrew said finally. "She will be apprehended at Southampton within the next 2 hours." "Yes," Wimsey agreed, though his voice carried none of the satisfaction that typically accompanies the resolution of a case. "And she will learn that she has become, in the end, what she always was. Profoundly, irredeemably alone." Eleanor Ashford was apprehended at the Southampton docks at precisely 11:47 in the morning, exactly as Pettigrew's telegram had predicted. She was standing at the departure gate for the French steamer, valise in hand, ticket in pocket, when the constables approached her. She did not attempt to flee. She did not resist. She merely turned to face them with the expression of someone who had already accepted the inevitability of her circumstances, and found, in that acceptance, a peculiar form of peace. The interrogation room at Derby Police Station was deliberately austere. Grey walls, wooden table, the sort of institutional bleakness designed to strip away pretense and encourage confession. Eleanor sat across from Wimsey with her hands folded precisely as her mother's had been, and her composure suggested that she had inherited more than mere physical features from Catherine Volkova. "You knew," Wimsey said, without preamble. "You knew what your mother intended to do?" "Not with certainty," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying the measured quality of someone speaking a language she had learned but not naturally acquired. "But I knew the trajectory toward which she was moving. She had been in declining health for some months. She spoke of endings rather than beginnings, and when the letter arrived from Sophia, when I understood that the secret was finally becoming unsustainable, I knew that Mother would choose to resolve matters in her own manner, rather than allow circumstances to dictate resolution to her." "Why not prevent her?" Pettigrew asked, his tone carrying the incomprehension of a man for whom such a choice would have been unthinkable. "Why not attempt to dissuade her?" Eleanor's eyes, which were distinctly Catherine's eyes, regarded him with something approaching pity. "Because my mother had lived 3 decades in a prison of her own construction, sustained only by the fiction that her sacrifice was serving some purpose. When that fiction collapsed, when Sir Geoffrey discovered the truth, when Sophia demanded acknowledgement, when the entire elaborate deception began to crumble, what purpose remained? What could possibly justify another year of hiding, of false names, of stolen life?" Wimsey leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Tell me about your father, the man Catherine married before Sir Geoffrey Ashford." Eleanor's composure shifted, fractionally but perceptibly. "His name was Dmitri Volkova. He was an officer in the Russian Imperial Guard. My mother was very young, very beautiful, and wholly unprepared for the man he was. He was jealous, controlling, and entirely intolerant of the fact that my mother could not be molded into the form he required. When she became pregnant, with me, he determined that I should be raised by relatives whilst my mother was confined to a convent to contemplate her failures as a wife. And your mother escaped this arrangement. She ran. She came to England with nothing but the clothes she wore and the name Catherine Volkova, which was not her birth name. She took a position as a governess. She eventually met Sir Geoffrey, and she allowed herself to believe that she could construct a new life, that her past could be genuinely left behind. But the past, as it always does, found her. Or rather, I found her. You sought her out deliberately, Wimsey said, and this was not a question. I was raised in Russia by aunts who despised me for my mother's abandonment. I grew to womanhood knowing nothing but shame and rejection. When I was old enough to act independently, I determined to find my mother and to understand why she had deemed it necessary to surrender me. It took me years of searching, of following fragmentary clues, of piecing together the history of a woman who had very deliberately obscured her own existence. And when I finally located her, when I finally stood before the woman who had abandoned me, she wept, and she confessed everything. Eleanor paused, collecting herself. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. She asked me for something extraordinary. She asked me to become her. Not literally, of course, but to assume her identity, to insert myself into her life with Sir Geoffrey, to allow her to disappear whilst maintaining the appearance that Catherine Ashford still existed. She explained that Sir Geoffrey had discovered her secret, not about me, but about her nature, about the fact that she could not be what any man required. She explained that she could not bear to remain in that marriage, but she also could not bear to abandon him entirely. So she asked me to be the anchor that would allow her to remain hidden, but financially secure. And you agreed to this arrangement, Wimsey said softly. I agreed because my mother asked it of me. Because after a lifetime of feeling abandoned, I finally had the opportunity to serve some purpose in her life, because I was young and foolish and believed that love could justify any deception. Eleanor's hands twisted together. But the years passed, Lord Peter. Year after year of pretending to be a woman I had never met, of living with a man I did not know, of maintaining a fiction that became increasingly elaborate and increasingly burdensome. I aged into the role. I became, in fact, the woman I had merely assumed to be. Wimsey rose and moved toward the window, which overlooked the grey city streets. Your mother knew that Thomas Herrick would eventually break. She knew that the secret was becoming unsustainable, and she knew that Sir Geoffrey would not survive the revelation of what he had been complicit in maintaining. Yes, Eleanor said. She told me as much when we last spoke. She said that Sir Geoffrey had finally understood the full scope of what his love had cost him. Not merely the money, but the fundamental corruption of his life around a lie. She said he would choose death rather than live with that knowledge. And yet she did not attempt to prevent his suicide. No, Eleanor said quietly, because she understood that his death was the only way to resolve the matter with any dignity. If he lived, the scandal would be inescapable. The deception would be exposed, his reputation destroyed, mine destroyed as well. But if he died by his own hand, the scandal could be contained, the nature of his death could be managed, and my mother, Catherine, could finally disappear entirely, released from the obligation that had bound her for 3 decades. She never intended to flee, Wimsey said, understanding crystallizing. She always intended to follow your father into death. Yes, Eleanor confirmed. She had already obtained the means long before Sir Geoffrey's death. She was simply waiting for the precise moment when her departure would not seem to constitute flight, but rather the logical conclusion of a tragedy that had been unfolding for 31 years. When I left Ashford Manor, I believed I was going to rescue her, but she had already determined that rescue was impossible. All that remained was for me to arrive after it was too late, so that at least one person would know the truth of what she had chosen. The interrogation room fell silent, broken only by the distant sounds of the police station carrying on its ordinary business, indifferent to the extraordinary revelations contained within its walls. The legal apparatus ground forward with the mechanical precision of a machine that has operated without modification for centuries. Eleanor Ashford was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, with complicity in the maintenance of false identity, with being an accessory after the fact to Sir Geoffrey's suicide. The charges were simultaneously comprehensive and curiously inadequate, for they addressed the mechanics of deception whilst failing entirely to capture the tragic geometry that had produced it. Wimsey attended the preliminary hearing at the magistrate's court, sitting in the gallery with the detached expression of a man observing a theatrical performance he had already seen rehearsed multiple times. The proceedings unfolded exactly as legal proceedings invariably do. Questions asked, answers given, the slow accumulation of facts that somehow managed to obscure rather than illuminate the essential truth of what had occurred. Eleanor's solicitor, a competent man named Hartwell who had been engaged through the Ashford estate's legal representatives, presented a defense that was simultaneously thorough and fundamentally flawed. He argued that Eleanor had been a victim of her mother's manipulation, that she had been coerced into assuming an identity not of her own choosing, that her participation in the deception had been motivated by filial obligation rather than criminal intent. The magistrate listened with the polite indifference of someone who had heard similar arguments countless times and had long since stopped believing that mitigation could render the legally indefensible somehow defensible. It was during the cross-examination that Wimsey rose and requested permission to address the court. The magistrate, recognizing Wimsey's standing and his involvement in the investigation, granted the request with the cautious courtesy of a man aware that he was in the presence of someone whose opinions carried weight beyond the immediate courtroom. "I believe," Wimsey said, his voice carrying the dry precision of formal address, "that the court may benefit from understanding the precise nature of the conspiracy that has been alleged. Eleanor Ashford is charged with maintaining a false identity, but the question becomes, what constitutes a false identity when the person who assumed it did so at the explicit request of the person whose identity she assumed? What constitutes fraud when the defrauded party was fully aware of the deception and actively participated in its maintenance?" The magistrate regarded him with the expression of someone who recognized a trap but could not quite determine which direction it was sprung. "You raise an interesting point, Lord Wimsey. But the legality of Eleanor Ashford's actions is not dependent upon her motivations." "Is it not?" Wimsey inquired, settling himself with the casual ease of a man about to deliver a lecture. "The law, in my experience, is fundamentally concerned with intent. Eleanor Ashford did not deceive Sir Geoffrey Ashford. She lived openly with him under an assumed name with his full knowledge and explicit consent. She did not defraud anyone. She inherited nothing that was not legally hers to inherit. She did not murder anyone. She stood by whilst another person made the choice to end his own existence." He paused, allowing the implications to settle. "What Eleanor did was participate in a deception that was entered into voluntarily by all parties concerned. She was complicit in maintaining a secret, but complicity in maintaining a secret, particularly when that secret was maintained with the active consent of the party most affected by it, is not precisely the same as conspiracy to defraud or any other charge that might sustain a conviction." The magistrate shifted uncomfortably. "Lord Wimsey, you are suggesting that no crime has been committed." "I am suggesting," Wimsey said carefully, "that the crime, if crime there be, exists primarily in the realm of moral philosophy rather than legal statute. Eleanor Ashford participated in an elaborate deception, but she did so at her mother's request, for her mother's purposes, with her mother's full direction. The true architect of the deception, Catherine Volkova, has removed herself permanently from legal jurisdiction by means of death. Eleanor is being prosecuted for following orders issued by her mother, a woman whose authority over her was both emotional and biological. "Are you suggesting we release her?" the magistrate asked, his tone suggesting that Wimsey was proposing something approaching legal blasphemy. "I'm suggesting," Wimsey said, "that the court consider whether conviction serves any meaningful purpose. Eleanor Ashford will be imprisoned for however many years this court deems appropriate. But imprisonment will not return Sir Geoffrey Ashford to life. It will not restore Thomas Herrick from his self-inflicted death. It will not repair the damage that Catherine Volkova's original deception set in motion 31 years ago. What imprisonment will do is punish a woman for the crime of loving her mother too completely and too uncritically. Whether such punishment constitutes justice or merely the perpetuation of tragedy is a question I leave to the court's conscience." There was a prolonged silence. The magistrate consulted quietly with his clerk. Eleanor sat motionless in the dock, her expression unchanged, as though she had already accepted whatever outcome the legal system would produce, and had determined that acceptance was preferable to false hope. "The court will take a brief recess," the magistrate announced finally. "We will reconvene in 1 hour." In the corridors outside the courtroom, Pettigrew approached Wimsey with the expression of a man who was not entirely certain whether he had just witnessed brilliant advocacy or the subversion of justice itself. "You had no obligation to speak, you know. The case was straightforward." "Was it?" Wimsey replied, beginning to walk toward the exit. "The case was straightforward if one views it through the lens of law alone. But law and justice are not identical, Inspector. A woman was driven to an elaborate deception by circumstance and by love. Another woman was driven to suicide by shame and by the inability to endure the weight of her own secrets. A third woman has been driven to participate in the first woman's deception and now faces prosecution for her filial loyalty. What point does the machinery of law cease to serve justice and begin instead to perpetuate cruelty?" "You believe Eleanor should be released," Pettigrew said. "I believe," Wimsey corrected, "that Eleanor should be allowed to understand that the choices she made, whatever their legal status, were comprehensible to at least one observer who does not view human behavior exclusively through the lens of statute and precedent." When the magistrate reconvened, the charges against Eleanor Ashford were reduced to a single count of assuming a false identity, with sentencing deferred pending further consideration. Wimsey departed the courtroom without waiting for the final disposition, understanding that justice, in this particular matter, would be served not by law, but by the slow, grinding mills of conscience and memory. 6 weeks later, Wimsey received a letter postmarked from a small village in the Cotswolds. The handwriting was Eleanor's, precise and controlled, bearing the marks of a woman who had learned to discipline emotion through the medium of careful penmanship. He opened it in his study at Duke's Denver, Bunter standing discreetly at attention with the manner of one prepared to offer commentary, should commentary prove welcome. "My dear Lord Peter," the letter began, "I write to you from a place of some peace, which may seem extraordinary given the circumstances of my detention and the uncertainty that still surrounds my legal disposition. The magistrate, in his final determination, has sentenced me to 3 years' imprisonment with possibility of parole after 18 months, contingent upon my good conduct and cooperation with authorities regarding the full extent of the deception I maintained. I have accepted this sentence without protest, for it represents, in my view, the precise balance between law and mercy that you so eloquently articulated in the courtroom. But I write not to discuss my imprisonment, which I approach with something approaching equanimity. I write rather to inform you of a discovery I made whilst arranging my affairs prior to my commitment. In the safe deposit box that my mother had maintained for 3 decades, a box to which Sir Geoffrey had provided me with access, though I was never entirely certain why, I discovered documents that may interest you. They concern not the deception that destroyed Sir Geoffrey, but the deception that preceded it, the one which created the necessity for all that followed. Wimsey set down the letter and gestured for Bunter to fetch the accompanying parcel, which had been delivered separately and now sat upon the sideboard with the appearance of something simultaneously precious and dangerous. The documents within, Eleanor's letter continued, establish that Sir Geoffrey was not merely complicit in my mother's disappearance, he orchestrated it. My mother did not flee from her marriage to escape her own nature, as she claimed. She fled because Sir Geoffrey had discovered something about her that would have destroyed not merely his marriage, but his entire social position had it become public knowledge. He chose, in his own way, to love her by allowing her to disappear. He chose to sustain her through decades of payments and false identities because he could not bear to live in a world that knew the truth about Catherine Volkova. The specific nature of this truth is contained in the documents within the parcel. I trust you will handle them with the discretion that has characterized your involvement in this entire tragic affair. What Sir Geoffrey protected through 31 years of deception is not mine to reveal, but I thought you should understand that the man who died in his study was not merely a man driven to despair by discovering his wife's deception. He was a man who finally understood that all his years of protection, all his sacrifice, had been insufficient to prevent the very exposure he had sought to prevent. Wimsey opened the parcel with deliberate care. Inside lay a collection of documents in Russian, along with certified English translations. They pertained to Catherine Volkova's original marriage to Dmitri Volkova, to her life in Russia, to her family status and connections. But what made the documents significant was a particular notation, repeated throughout the correspondence, regarding Catherine's condition and her unsuitability for the life Dmitri had attempted to construct for her. The language was oblique, as such matters necessarily were in the Victorian era, but the meaning was clear enough to a man of Wimsey's education and experience. Catherine Volkova was what contemporary medical science would have termed a sapphist, a woman whose emotional and romantic inclinations were directed toward members of her own sex rather than toward men. Dmitri Volkova had discovered this fact, had attempted to cure her through confinement and religious instruction, and had ultimately determined that she was beyond redemption. Catherine's disappearance from Russia was not a romantic escape to England, but rather a calculated flight from a husband who had concluded that her nature was fundamentally incompatible with the existence he wished to impose upon her. Wimsey set down the documents and sat very still for a considerable time, absorbing the full implications of what he had just discovered. Everything that had followed, the deception, the elaborate maintenance of a false marriage, the 31 years of hidden payments, the suicide, the conspiracy, all of it traced back to this single, irrevocable fact. Sir Geoffrey Ashford had married a woman whom circumstances had rendered incapable of being a wife in the manner he required, and rather than condemn her or expose her, he had chosen to love her through the mechanism of her disappearance. Extraordinary, Bunter murmured, having read the translations over Wimsey's shoulder with the efficient discretion that characterized his entire existence. Sir, Geoffrey Ashford demonstrates a quality of love that transcends conventional morality, sir. A love sufficiently profound to sustain itself across decades of separation and deception. Or a love sufficiently misdirected to destroy everyone it touched, Wimsey replied, his voice carrying an undertone of something approaching anguish. Consider what it cost, Bunter. It cost Catherine 31 years of hiding. It cost Eleanor her entire life, consumed in the maintenance of a fiction designed to protect a secret she did not fully understand. It cost Thomas Herrick his conscience and ultimately his life. And it cost Sir Geoffrey himself, the man who initiated the deception in an attempt to protect the woman he loved. His entire existence, ending not in reconciliation or peace, but in suicide, born of the knowledge that his protection had ultimately been insufficient. He rose and moved to the window, where the grey London afternoon offered no comfort and no answers. We speak of love as though it were an unambiguous good, Bunter. But love, when misdirected or when expressed through deception, can become as destructive as hatred. Sir Geoffrey's love for Catherine was genuine, profoundly so, but it was also poisoned by the very mechanism through which he attempted to express it, through lies, through stolen identities, through the systematic corruption of every relationship he maintained. "What will you do with these documents, sir?" Bunter asked carefully. Wimsey turned from the window, his expression set with the gravity of someone making a decision that would have consequences he could not fully predict. "I will destroy them," he said quietly. "Catherine Volkova deserves to rest unmolested by the revelation of her private nature. Eleanor has suffered sufficient exposure already, and Sir Geoffrey's memory deserves to remain ambiguous, neither condemned nor wholly absolved, suspended in that space between judgment and forgiveness where most of us ultimately reside." He returned to the desk and, without further consideration, consigned the documents to the fire, watching as the papers curled and blackened and disintegrated into ash. When nothing remained but smoke and the faint smell of burning paper, he sat down and composed a reply to Eleanor, writing with the measured care of a man constructing not merely a letter, but a benediction. The letter Wimsey composed took considerably longer than his usual correspondence, requiring 3 complete revisions before he achieved the precise balance of acknowledgement and discretion that the circumstances demanded. When at last he was satisfied with his words, he sealed it with his personal wax and entrusted it to Bunter for posting with explicit instructions that it be delivered by hand rather than through the ordinary post. "My dear Eleanor," it began, "I've received your letter and the accompanying materials. I wish to assure you that your trust in my discretion has not been misplaced. The documents you forwarded have been examined and subsequently destroyed, leaving no trace of their existence save in the memory of one individual who has long since learned to compartmentalize such knowledge in the manner that survival sometimes requires. What you have revealed to me does not alter my assessment of the events at Ashford Manor. If anything, it renders them more comprehensible and simultaneously more tragic. Your mother's life was defined by a fundamental incompatibility between her nature and the world's willingness to accommodate it. Your father's, for I think we may now acknowledge Sir Geoffrey as your father in every meaningful sense, was defined by the impossible attempt to bridge that incompatibility through deception and sacrifice. That both ultimately failed should surprise no one who understands the mechanics of human emotion. But I write primarily to tell you something you should know, though I suspect you may have already intuited it through the clarity that comes from extended confinement and the absence of distraction. You are not responsible for what has transpired. Neither your mother's deception, nor your father's suicide, nor the cascading series of events that led to Thomas Herrick's death can be attributed to any failure on your part. You were a woman caught between 2 irreconcilable versions of love. Your mother's love, which expressed itself through concealment and flight, and your father's love, which expressed itself through sacrifice and ultimately through despair. That you attempted to honor both is not a moral failure, but a measure of your capacity for loyalty. I do not know what the next 18 months will bring. I do not know whether the magistrate will grant you parole or whether you will serve your full sentence. But I can tell you with certainty that when you emerge from whatever incarceration lies ahead, you will have the opportunity to construct a life that is genuinely your own. Not your mother's life, not your father's construction, but Eleanor's. That opportunity, hard-won though it may be, represents something approaching redemption in the secular sense. I remain, as always, your humble servant in pursuit of truth, however painful that pursuit may become. The letter dispatched, Wimsey found himself possessed of the peculiar emptiness that comes when a case, having consumed one's attention entirely, suddenly concludes. The investigation into the death of Sir Geoffrey Ashford was, in official terms, closed. The coroner had determined suicide. Eleanor had been convicted and sentenced. Thomas Herrick's death was documented as suicide precipitated by guilt. All the machinery of law and order had ground to its conclusion, and yet Wimsey found himself unable to achieve the sense of completion that usually accompanied such finality. He spent the following days in a state of contemplative melancholy, that Bunter recognized as characteristic of cases that had wounded Wimsey's sensibilities rather than merely engaged his intellect. The detective moved through his London residence with the distracted manner of a man whose body was present but whose consciousness remained fixated elsewhere. He attended a concert at the Wigmore Hall and found himself unable to concentrate on the music. He visited his club and found the conversation of his fellows remarkably tedious. He attempted to read and found his mind wandering from the page after merely a few paragraphs. It was on the 8th day following Eleanor's conviction that Wimsey received a visitor of an entirely unexpected variety. Madame Irina Volkova presented herself at his residence on a grey November afternoon, dressed in black silk and bearing herself with the composed dignity of a woman accustomed to moving through the world according to her own specifications, rather than those imposed by others. Wimsey received her in his study with the careful courtesy that such an interview demanded. He offered tea, which she accepted, and observed her with the focused attention of a man who recognized that this woman possessed knowledge that might illuminate aspects of the affair that remained somewhat opaque. "I have come," Madame Volkova said, dispensing with preliminary pleasantries, "to thank you for your discretion regarding my sister's nature. It was Eleanor who informed me that certain documents had been destroyed. I wished to ensure that you understood the significance of what those documents contained, and to confirm that your decision to render them permanently inaccessible was consonant with my own wishes." "Your sister's private life was not mine to expose," Wimsey replied evenly, "and whatever truth those documents contained belonged to her alone. That truth died with her." "On the contrary," Madame Volkova said, her dark eyes carrying an expression of something approaching sadness. "That truth dies with each generation, only to be rediscovered by the next. Catherine's shame became Eleanor's burden. Eleanor's burden will become someone else's struggle. This is the nature of secrets. They do not truly die, they merely find new vessels to contain them." She rose to depart, pausing at the threshold. "You may wonder why Catherine chose to end her life rather than attempt escape with Eleanor. The answer is quite simple. She understood, finally, that some lives cannot be escaped, but only concluded. She had lived 31 years in hiding. She would not live 32. At least, in choosing her own moment of departure, she retained some small measure of dignity and agency. Perhaps you might consider that as you contemplate the morality of what has transpired." After Madame Volkova departed, Wimsey sat in the gathering darkness of his study, understanding at last that the investigation into Sir Geoffrey Ashford's death was not concluded, but merely transformed into a meditation on love, deception, and the terrible price that sometimes must be paid for the privilege of existing authentically in a world that demands conformity as the price of acceptance. 3 months into Eleanor's imprisonment at Holloway, Wimsey received notice that she had been granted an audience with the Home Secretary regarding a petition for early parole. The petition itself was unremarkable. The usual formalities, character references from the magistrate, evidence of exemplary conduct during her confinement. But the accompanying letter from Eleanor's solicitor contained a request that stopped Wimsey mid-morning coffee. Would he be willing to testify on Eleanor's behalf regarding her character and the mitigating circumstances surrounding her conviction? He attended the hearing on a February morning when the London streets were grey and damp and the very architecture of the city seemed designed to suppress hope. The Home Secretary's office was a study in institutional power. High ceilings, mahogany panelling, the accumulated weight of governmental authority rendered tangible in wood and stone. Eleanor sat at a small table, dressed in the prison grey that had become her uniform, and her expression suggested that she had come to view this proceeding not as a test of her worthiness, but as a formality in the slow process of her rehabilitation. Wimsey testified with the precision that characterized all his professional utterances. He spoke of Eleanor's cooperation with the investigation, of the mitigating circumstances surrounding her participation in the deception, of the profound and tragic nature of the forces that had shaped her life. He spoke carefully, avoiding any suggestion that her conviction had been unjust, while simultaneously suggesting that justice itself was a more complicated concept than the law alone could encompass. Eleanor Ashford, he concluded, addressing the Home Secretary directly, is a woman whose loyalty to her mother was genuine and whose participation in deception was motivated by filial obligation rather than malice. She is not a criminal in any meaningful sense. She is a woman who loved unwisely and too completely, and who has paid for that love with the loss of her autonomy, her name, and her place in the world. Further punishment, in my estimation, serves neither justice nor the interests of society. The Home Secretary made his decision without evident deliberation. Eleanor would be released on parole within the week, her sentence suspended subject to conditions of good conduct and regular reporting to the authorities. She would be forbidden from residing within 20 miles of Derbyshire. She would be prohibited from disposing of or alienating any of Sir Geoffrey's estate pending the resolution of inheritance disputes. But she would be free. As Eleanor rose to accept this decision, her eyes briefly met Wimsey's, and in that moment of connection, something passed between them. Not gratitude precisely, but rather an acknowledgment of the terrible complexity of human suffering and the inadequacy of any single person's ability to mitigate it. In the days following her release, Eleanor sent word through her solicitor that she wished to meet with Wimsey. They met at a tea room near the British Museum, a neutral space devoid of the emotional architecture that either Ashford Manor or the police station would have carried. Eleanor appeared diminished by her imprisonment, thinner, greyer in appearance, but her composure remained intact, the result of months spent in contemplation and the development of emotional discipline that only confinement could produce. "I have determined what I shall do with the estate," Eleanor said without preamble, her tea untouched before her. "I shall place the manor in trust, to be maintained as a school for girls without means. Sir Geoffrey's financial holdings I shall distribute among various charitable institutions, hospitals, libraries, organizations dedicated to the welfare of those whom society has rendered invisible. I have no use for wealth accumulated through such tragedy. I have no desire to remain at Ashford Manor, where every room carries the imprint of deception and where the walls themselves seem to mock the possibility of authentic existence." "And what will you do?" Wimsey asked gently. "Where will you go?" "To Switzerland," Eleanor replied. "There is a small community near Geneva, women living in relative independence, engaged in scholarly pursuits. I have made arrangements to join them. I shall use my mother's birth name, Catherine Volkova, in honor of her memory, and as a small rebellion against the necessity of assuming yet another false identity. But this time, I choose the name. This time, I construct the identity myself, rather than accepting it as a burden handed down from those who came before." Wimsey nodded slowly, understanding in that moment the precise nature of the redemption that Eleanor had managed to forge from the wreckage of her life. "Your mother would have been proud," he said quietly. "I do not know that pride is what my mother felt about anything," Eleanor replied, a faint smile crossing her face, "but perhaps acceptance. Perhaps the knowledge that her daughter had learned to survive not through the perpetuation of deception, but through the careful construction of a life that was, at least in some meaningful sense, genuinely her own." As they parted, Eleanor extended her hand in the formal manner of strangers concluding a business transaction. But Wimsey took it with the warmth of one who had witnessed her suffering and who recognized in her capacity to move forward an achievement that transcended mere legal exoneration. "Farewell, Eleanor," he said. "May you find in Switzerland what your mother and your father could not find in England, the possibility of being authentically yourself without the necessity of deception." "Farewell, Lord Peter," she replied, "and thank you for understanding, however imperfectly, what compelled me to the choices I made." Months later, Wimsey would receive a single letter from Switzerland, postmarked from a small village in the Valais region. It contained no words, merely a pressed flower, a edelweiss, the alpine flower that grows in places where survival requires adaptation and stubbornness in equal measure. He placed it carefully between the pages of his copy of Marlowe's Faustus, where it would remain until the end of his life, a small symbol of the complicated redemption that follows in the wake of tragedy. The investigation into the death of Sir Geoffrey Ashford, which had begun with a woman's complaint about footsteps in a corridor, had concluded not with the conviction of a murderer, but with the slow, painful reconstruction of a shattered woman's capacity to exist authentically in the world. It was perhaps not the resolution that the law had intended, but it was, in Wimsey's considered judgment, something closer to justice than the machinery of courts and magistrates could ever produce. He returned to London and to his ordinary existence, carrying with him the knowledge that sometimes the most profound mysteries are not those involving the commission of crime, but those involving the human capacity to love, to deceive, and to forgive in the face of circumstances that would have justified condemnation. And in the quiet of his study, with Bunter attending to the ordinary details of his life, Wimsey contemplated the precise mechanism through which a woman's loyalty to her mother had led to the destruction of multiple lives, and the equally precise mechanism through which that same woman had managed to extract meaning and purpose from the ruins of that destruction. It was, he reflected, the nearest thing to tragedy that modern London could produce. Not the grand, sweeping catastrophes of Shakespeare's imagination, but the small, meticulous accumulation of deceptions that destroyed not through violence, but through the slow erosion of the possibility of authentic existence. And in understanding that, Wimsey came to a conclusion that would inform the remainder of his investigative career: that the most dangerous crimes were not those committed in passion or greed, but those committed in love, where the perpetrator genuinely believed that deception served a greater good than truth could ever provide. The case of the hallway footstep paradox was closed, filed away in official records as a matter of suicide and conspiracy, lacking any murderer to punish or victim to vindicate. And yet it remained in Wimsey's consciousness the most profound investigation he had undertaken, not because of its solution, but because of what that solution had revealed about the terrible beauty of human suffering and the fragile mechanisms through which we all construct the illusions that allow us to continue living.